Billingslea, I still have some issues that I want to pursue on the other matter, and I will pursue those. But since you're here and the chairman has decided to move forward with your nomination, let me ask you some questions. I want to ask you questions particularly on your record on interrogation and torture. Do you consider the bipartisan 2008 SASC detainee report an accurate and reliable account of the events that led to the abuse of detainees in U.S. custody?
Senator, I do.
The SASC report found that the interrogation techniques requested by Gitmo on October 11th of 2002 and approved by Secretary Rumsfeld in December, quote, influenced and contributed to the use of abusive techniques including military working dogs, forced nudities, stress positions in Afghanistan and Iraq. October 10th, the day before Gitmo made that formal response, was the last day of an 8-day interrogation of one of the detainees, which had used military dogs and stress positions. It was also the day, October 10th, that military personnel from the Afghanistan Special Mission Unit Task Force, over which your office at DOD exercised policy oversight, left Gitmo after studying the new interrogation techniques. On October 10th, that also was the day that you wrote a memo, to Secretary Rumsfeld titled Detainees at Gitmo. While in this setting I cannot say exactly what you wrote in that memo, I can say that I found it very disturbing, and I urge my colleagues on both sides of the committee to read that important memo. Mr. Billingslea, I want to ask you about another memo that we can't talk about in public that you wrote, this one in April of 2003, titled Interrogation Methods for Gitmo. In it, you recommended that Secretary Rumsfeld approve 11 interrogation techniques which you supported, but at that point, he no longer did, meaning the Secretary. These are the same techniques that the SASC report concluded, bipartisan SASC report concluded, led to abuses in Afghanistan and Iraq. In the memo, which is quoted in the SASC report, you wrote that the techniques were, quote, not controversial from either a legal or policy standpoint, end quote. But the judge advocate generals from every military service raised serious legal and policy objectives to these techniques, including that they violated the UCMJ and domestic criminal law and could expose service members to possible prosecution, would have a negative effect on the treatment of U.S. POWs by their captors, would adversely impact the pride, discipline, and self-respect within the United States Armed Forces, and would adversely affect human intelligence exploitation and surrender of foreign enemy forces in cooperation and support of friendly nations, close quote. Why did you write that stress positions, hooding, 20-hour interrogations, forced grooming, and scenarios designed to convince the detainee that death or severely painful consequences were imminent for him or his family were not controversial, when all the military services had clearly stated that they were highly controversial?
Senator, I was not then, and I am not today, an expert on interrogation. I had to rely on the time, on what people from the combatant commands told us about how different techniques would be used, and I had to rely on lawyers up and down the chain of command to tell us that these things were legal. I never supported any measure that was even remotely possibly determined to be illegal by the lawyers. In fact, in 2015, Congress passed a law making clear what is allowable and what is not. But this was 2002. We didn't have the benefit of the investigation that you referenced by the bipartisan group of the Senate Armed Services Committee. And I was in the Pentagon on 9/11. Many of us remember those dark days. Some of the interrogation techniques, as you point out, that were proposed by the combatant command, not by me, in the aftermath of the attack are now clearly prohibited by law. And if I were ever called upon, and I hope never to be again, to have a view on these matters, I would without question uphold the law and reject anything not contained in the Army Field Manual. Now, Senator, I am honored and I'm humbled that Senator John McCain voted for my confirmation to the current position. As we all know, he was tortured gravely by the North Vietnamese. He would not have done that if I were a torture advocate. The different assertions that are being made in the press in the past days are decades-old claims that were examined and discarded by the very investigation of the Senate Armed Services Committee that you referenced. That bipartisan investigation lasted a year and a half. They reviewed hundreds of thousands of documents. They interviewed in person more than 70 people, and they did not ever ask to talk to me. And the reason is that they knew I was not involved in advocating for torture, Senator. In fact, don't take my word for it. Take Senator Levin's one of his own lead investigators, Dr. Mark Jacobson, who has written letters on my behalf and made himself available to your staff on the minority committee staff, who has made crystal clear that I did not advocate for torture, that I was not in a deciding role, and that I was one of the key people trying to bring order to an orderless, chaotic process at Gitmo.
I've allowed you to use most of my time to answer the question because it's a serious one. And in follow-ups, I'd like to explore what you just answered because, in fact, you were the author of the memos. You were the approver of some others. So regardless of what you try now to describe was the framework, you know, maybe this wouldn't be an issue except for the position that you're being nominated for. You're going to travel the world on behalf of the United States. You're going to speak out against torture. You're going to supposedly speak out for human rights. Well, it's difficult to be in some country in the world speaking about that when they're going to reference your own history. And that's why I'm asking this line of questioning, but in deference to my colleagues, I'll wait for our second round.